At exactly 3 p.m. local time, the Caribbean appeared completely calm. The water stretched flat beneath the bright afternoon sun. The trade winds moved steadily across the surface. Visibility was almost perfect. To most vessels passing through the region, it would have looked like an ordinary day at sea. But for the sailors standing watch, that calm was already beginning to feel deceptive. On the radar displays, a pattern slowly started to take shape. At first, the contacts looked routine, distant surface vessels, nothing unusual. But then their movement began to change in a way trained observers do not ignore. Courses shifted, speeds increased, bearings started to converge. Not randomly, deliberately. One by one, several Venezuelan surface vessels adjusted their headings, turning toward the projected route of an American carrier group moving through international waters. On the bridge, there was no shouting, no panic, just quiet confirmation. The contacts were maneuvering with intent. A carrier group does not move blindly through the ocean. Every mile around it is watched, measured, and recorded. Radar teams followed the changes in speed down to the knot. Operations teams recalculated the closest points of approach in real time. What the Venezuelan ships were doing was subtle, but it was clear. They were trying to position themselves in the way. A move like that is not accidental. At sea, distance matters, course matters, timing matters. A small change in direction can be explained as navigation, but a steady intercept path is different. As the minutes passed, the picture became sharper. The Venezuelan vessels were no longer simply shadowing the American formation. They were testing the boundary. How close could they get? How much pressure could they apply? How would the U.S. Navy respond? Still, the American formation stayed steady. The carrier held its course. Escort ships remained in position, spread outward like a moving shield. There were no dramatic turns, no sudden bursts of speed, and no visible overreaction. The message was quiet but unmistakable. We see you. Inside the operations rooms, the posture shifted from routine monitoring to full documentation. Every radar signal from the approaching vessels was captured. Every movement was time-stamped. Optical sensors focused in, sending high-resolution imagery to analysts who did not need guesses. They needed facts. This was not about reacting quickly. It was about responding correctly. Encounters like this are rarely designed to create an open clash. They are usually designed to create friction. A moment, a headline, a short clip that can later be shaped into a story of resistance or success. Force the carrier to turn. Force a visible response. Force a narrative. But a carrier group is not a single ship that can simply be pushed aside. It is a coordinated system built to absorb pressure without losing formation. The closer the Venezuelan ships came, the more they revealed about their coordination, their confidence, their limits, and their understanding of the situation. And the closer they moved, the calmer the American response became. There were no dramatic messages sent over open channels, no theatrical warnings. Standard bridge-to-bridge calls went out, professional and precise, stating position, course, and the lawful status of the transit. No answer came back. That silence said more than any reply could have. By then, everyone involved understood the seriousness of the moment. Not because a direct clash was expected, but because this was exactly the kind of encounter where small mistakes can echo for years. One miscalculation, one unnecessary reaction, one decision made too quickly. That is how routine patrols become international incidents. So the carrier group did what it was trained to do. It kept moving. The sea stayed calm. The sky remained clear. But beneath that calm, something important had changed. A line had been tested, not by contact, but by intent. Venezuela had chosen to move into the path of one of the most disciplined naval formations in the world. And from that moment forward, everything was being recorded. By 3:12 p.m., the pattern was no longer open to interpretation. The Venezuelan vessels had closed the distance enough that their intentions could be measured, not guessed. Their speed changes were consistent. Their headings were deliberate. Instead of holding parallel tracks or wide shadowing arcs, they angled inward, cutting across projected routes and tightening the space ahead. This was not routine presence. On American displays, the closest point of approach continued to shrink. First 5 nautical miles, then 4. Each update brought a new calculation of time and distance. The numbers were clear. If nothing changed, the Venezuelan formation would pass directly ahead of the carrier group within minutes. Still, the American ships did not alter course. In naval operations, holding course can be one of the strongest statements possible. It signals confidence. It removes confusion. Most importantly, it denies the other side the reaction they may be trying to provoke. The Venezuelan vessels kept pressing. Radio silence continued. There was no bridge-to-bridge coordination. No clarification of intent, no professional explanation for why the distance was closing so quickly. For experienced watch officers, that absence mattered. Professional crews communicate when space becomes tight. Silence at close range is not an accident. It is a choice. From Venezuela's perspective, the maneuver may have seemed useful. On paper, they could not outmatch a carrier group. That was never the goal. The goal was pressure. Make the Americans adjust. Create footage that could be described later as defiance. Show a domestic audience that their navy had stood up to a global power. But the ocean does not reward theater. It rewards discipline. As the gap narrowed, American escort ships adjusted their internal spacing with quiet precision. Nothing looked aggressive from the outside, but the formation became sharper. Sensors shifted priority. Surface search systems refined their focus. Electro-optical cameras tracked hull numbers, deck activity, and crew movement. Everything happening on the Venezuelan ships was now visible, enlarged, and archived. Every maneuver was logged. The atmosphere remained controlled. No raised voices, no rushed orders. Just a steady stream of information. Bearings, speeds, distances, signals, and movement. Each Venezuelan ship was no longer just a contact on a screen. It was becoming a profile, and profiles tell stories. They showed small signs of hesitation in formation keeping, minor mismatches in speed, slight course corrections that suggested uncertainty rather than confidence. This did not look like a rehearsed maneuver by a navy accustomed to working near major naval formations. It looked like pressure being applied carefully, cautiously, with constant attention to how the Americans might respond. The carrier group did not change its behavior. Standard maritime messages were transmitted again, calm and legally precise. International waters, lawful transit, maintain safe distance. The messages were clear, professional, recorded, no reply. At 3:21 p.m., one Venezuelan vessel moved ahead of the others, briefly increasing speed beyond the rest of the formation. It was a probing move, a test to see whether the Americans would adjust. Would the carrier turn? Would the escorts visibly reposition? Would the formation break its rhythm? They did not. That was the moment when the balance began to shift. Pressure only works when the other side reacts. With every passing minute, the Venezuelan ships were using fuel, revealing patterns, broadcasting signals, and placing themselves deeper inside an encounter they did not control. The Americans, meanwhile, were collecting information without giving anything away. This is the quiet advantage modern naval power is built on. You do not need a dramatic move to control an encounter. You only need to remain composed long enough for the other side to reveal itself. At 3:28 p.m., the geometry finally stabilized. The Venezuelan ships held their positions just short of the intercept line, close enough to claim presence, not close enough to create an unavoidable situation. It was a pause, but it was not a success. By then, the attempted block had already failed. The carrier group had not changed course. It had not slowed. It had not acknowledged the pressure beyond standard procedure. And by doing so, it denied Venezuela the one thing the maneuver was designed to create: leverage. What remained was an uneasy standoff. One side steady and quiet, the other committed but unsure what came next. And in naval encounters, uncertainty is dangerous. Once pressure stops producing results, the only remaining options are to increase the risk or step away. Venezuela was quickly running out of room for both. By 3:30 p.m., the encounter entered its most sensitive phase, not because the situation had become dramatic on the surface, but because intent was now unmistakable. This is where less disciplined forces often make mistakes. The U.S. Navy did not. Across the carrier group, posture shifted internally. Sensor priorities tightened. Data feeds were checked and synchronized. What looked calm from above was, beneath the decks, a highly trained machine doing exactly what it was designed to do. Watch everything, record everything, reveal nothing. The carrier maintained course and speed. Escorts held formation, their spacing deliberate, their silhouettes unchanged. There was no sudden maneuver that could be framed as intimidation, no visible escalation that could be misunderstood. The message was restraint, but restraint backed by full awareness. That distinction matters. Restraint without capability can look weak. Restraint with capability is control. As the Venezuelan ships lingered near the intercept geometry, American sensors quietly took the lead. Surface search systems sharpened resolution, optical systems focused on bridge wings, mast arrays, and deck activity. Electronic teams logged signals, frequency, power, and duration. Every sweep from the Venezuelan vessels added another line to a growing file. In modern naval operations, information is leverage. The U.S. Navy was collecting it in bulk. At 3:34 p.m., an American helicopter lifted from the deck of an escort ship. The launch was smooth, unhurried, and professional. No low passes, no aggressive banking, just a controlled climb and a steady movement toward the contact area. From the Venezuelan perspective, the meaning was clear. There were now eyes overhead. The helicopter maintained safe altitude and distance. Its presence was not provocative, but it was impossible to ignore. Its sensors, however, were doing serious work. Infrared systems tracked engine heat and wake patterns. High-definition optics captured deck movement in real time. Every frame was geo-referenced and time-stamped. This was not a performance. It was documentation. Standard warnings were transmitted again, measured, precise, recorded. International waters, unsafe maneuvering, maintain distance. The tone never changed. Calm, professional, final. The Venezuelan ships answered not with words, but with hesitation. Speeds fluctuated slightly, course lines softened by a few degrees. Deck activity slowed. These were small details, but in close encounters, small details reveal state of mind. Confidence holds steady. Uncertainty wavers. The American formation remained unchanged. No one rushed the moment. No one tried to force a dramatic ending. The U.S. Navy does not operate on emotion. It operates on doctrine. And doctrine says that the longer you remain predictable, the more pressure shifts to the other side. By now, the Venezuelan crews were facing an uncomfortable reality. They had moved far enough into the maneuver that stepping away could look like backing down. But moving closer would bring risk they could not fully control. That is the trap of brinkmanship at sea. You move forward for effect. You pause for reaction. And when the reaction never comes, you are left exposed. Fuel burning, sensors active, crews under pressure, leadership waiting for a moment that never arrives. Inside the American operations rooms, there was no need for speculation. Everything important was already being captured. The encounter was no longer about who blocked whom. It was about who still had freedom of action. And that answer was already clear. At 3:42 p.m., the Venezuelan lead vessel began to reduce speed gradually. There was no announcement, no acknowledgement, just a subtle easing away from the line it had pushed toward only minutes earlier. The helicopter maintained its orbit. The escorts maintained formation. The carrier maintained course. No declarations, no radio triumph. Just professionalism doing its work. Because the most decisive moments at sea rarely look dramatic. To an untrained observer, they may look almost boring. But every sailor involved understood exactly what had happened. The attempted block failed not because it was challenged. It failed because it was ignored. And in the calculation of modern naval power, that can be the most decisive response of all. By 3:45 p.m., the outcome was no longer in doubt. The Venezuelan maneuver had reached its limit, not because the U.S. Navy forced it to stop, but because it stopped producing results. That is where the mistake became obvious. Blocking only works if the other side reacts. The plan depended on pressure-creating movement, a turn, a slowdown, a visible adjustment that could later be presented as success. But the carrier group never gave them that moment. No course change, no hesitation, no escalation. By refusing to react, the U.S. Navy reversed the entire situation. From that point on, every additional minute favored the Americans. Fuel consumption increased for the Venezuelan vessels. Their formation discipline loosened. Minor inconsistencies appeared. One ship lagged, another edged slightly too far ahead. These were not dramatic errors, but they mattered. They revealed the limits of coordination and endurance under sustained pressure. More importantly, the Venezuelan ships had already crossed the most costly threshold of all. They had allowed themselves to be studied. Every radar sweep, every engine surge, every deck movement, every small correction. All of it had been captured, cataloged, and archived. What began as an attempt to create a political image had turned into a live demonstration of Venezuelan naval behavior under pressure. That kind of data does not disappear. It gets studied, compared, filed alongside earlier encounters, used to refine future predictions about how a force moves, hesitates, presses forward, and eventually steps back. This is where the strategic miscalculation became clear. Venezuela was not trying to start a major confrontation, but by moving too close, it allowed itself to be measured by a force designed not only to deter, but to learn. The longer the Venezuelan ships remained near the formation, the more they gave away without receiving anything in return. The carrier group, meanwhile, lost nothing. Its formation remained intact. Its mission continued. Its crews stayed within doctrine. There was no dramatic footage to exploit, no sudden reaction to exaggerate, no moment that could be reshaped into a victory narrative. From a legal and operational standpoint, the Americans were exactly where they were supposed to be, doing what international law allowed. That asymmetry is damaging to brinkmanship. When one side is acting and the other is simply recording, the actor loses leverage first. At 3:51 p.m., the Venezuelan ships began to drift outward. Not sharply, not in an obvious retreat, but enough to break the geometry of the block. Speeds normalized, courses widened. The intercept line dissolved quietly, almost awkwardly. There was no announcement of disengagement, no acknowledgement that anything unusual had happened. But everyone involved understood the meaning. The maneuver had failed without a confrontation, without a dramatic signal, and without the Americans giving away the response Venezuela had been looking for. This is the paradox of modern naval power. The strongest response is often the least visible. It does not shout. It does not posture. It simply removes options from the other side until only one remains. In this case, that option was disengagement. The Venezuelan crews were left with footage showing ships approaching, lingering, and then easing away. No American turn, no forced reaction, no moment of triumph. Whatever message had been intended for domestic audiences now lacked a conclusion. The U.S. Navy, on the other hand, left with something far more useful than a headline. It left with clarity. Clarity about Venezuelan tactics, clarity about command confidence, clarity about how pressure was applied, and clarity about how quickly that pressure faded when it was not supported by real leverage. That is the real cost of the encounter. Future moments like this will not begin from zero. They will begin from what was learned here. Every move Venezuela made during the attempted block will be remembered, not as a display of strength, but as a case study in overreach. By the time the Caribbean returned to stillness, the carrier group was already miles beyond the point of contact. Steady on course, mission intact. The Venezuelan ships remained behind, scattered and silent, with little to show for the risk they had taken. That is why this was a mistake. Not because Venezuela challenged a carrier group, but because it challenged one without understanding what happens when pressure is applied to a force that does not need to react in order to prevail. By 4 p.m., the encounter was effectively over. The Venezuelan vessels had fallen back far enough that the geometry no longer mattered. Distances widened, bearings stabilized. What remained on American radar displays was no longer a challenge, just background traffic fading into the routine movement of the Caribbean Sea. The carrier group never slowed. From the deck of the carrier, nothing appeared unusual. Aircraft operations continued. Watch teams rotated on schedule. The ship's massive hull moved forward through calm water, steady and indifferent to what had unfolded miles behind it. That was the point. For the U.S. Navy, success was not measured by spectacle. It was measured by continuity. The mission was not interrupted. No detour was required. No emergency posture was needed. The group moved on exactly as planned, leaving behind an encounter that made little noise but carried a clear lesson for those who understood it. Because the real aftermath did not happen on the ocean. It happened in the data. Every sensor log, every radar return, every optical frame captured during the attempted block was already being compiled, compared, and analyzed. Not emotionally, not politically, professionally. Patterns were identified, movement behavior was mapped, reaction timelines were measured down to seconds. This is how modern naval power compounds its advantage, not through spectacle but through accumulation. For Venezuela, the immediate outcome was uncomfortable. There was no footage of an American retreat, no dramatic standoff to broadcast, no clean narrative of success. What remained was silence. And in these situations, silence is rarely neutral. It leaves questions unanswered. It invites scrutiny. It exposes intent without delivering a payoff. For the U.S. Navy, the outcome was simpler. Another transit completed, another encounter documented, another demonstration that restraint, when paired with capability, is not passivity. It is control exercised quietly. That distinction matters far beyond the Caribbean, because naval encounters are not isolated events. They become reference points. Each one shapes expectations for the next. Every action and every refusal to act creates a precedent that other commanders, governments, and crews will remember. What Venezuela attempted that afternoon was not new. Smaller navies have often used proximity and pressure to test larger forces. Sometimes it works. Sometimes it creates an overreaction. Sometimes it produces the image it was designed to create. This time, it did none of that. Instead, it revealed a basic misunderstanding. Power is not measured by how loudly a force responds. It is measured by how little it needs to. The carrier group did not turn. It did not posture. It did not escalate. And by doing so, it left Venezuela with only one safe option: step away quietly without acknowledgement. That outcome sends a message more lasting than any broadcast. It tells future challengers that pressure without leverage fades quickly. It shows that proximity without capability can end up helping the side that is prepared to wait. And it proves that in encounters like this, the most important moment is not when a force prepares for a dramatic response. It is when one side realizes the other never needed one. As the sun continued its slow descent over the Caribbean, the sea returned to the calm appearance it had carried all day. From a distance, it looked as if nothing had happened. But for those who were there, for the sailors watching the geometry, the analysts reviewing the data, and the commanders weighing the implications, the lesson was unmistakable. The U.S. Navy did not prevail through force. It prevailed through discipline. And for Venezuela, that is the hardest kind of setback to explain.